college, I volunteered at a senior center, and I did a lot of puzzles, taking trips to the local movie theater, but I felt like I wanted to do something more. And this was about the time where poker was being televised on TV, some of these poker tournaments, and I thought it would be really fun if we had a poker club at the senior center. So I put out a sign-up sheet. I talked to some people who were really interested in it, but no one signed up for the poker club. And it was a little strange, so I went around and asked some people why they weren't signing up, and they said, well, we would, but we're really afraid people are going to talk politics at the poker club. And so I said, well, I think I have a solution to this. So we would create a poker club, and there would be 2 rules to poker club. The first rule to poker club is we're not allowed to bet real money. And the second rule to poker club is you're not allowed to talk politics. So poker club started. We had about 12 people. We had it going for several weeks, and we were going great. Great fun. But on a day in the 3rd week, there was a lull in the conversation, and one of the poker players got a little bold and said, you know, this guy running for Senate, I don't like him. He's a bum, and I don't like anything he stands for. The room froze, and one by one, people got up and left the room. And so as I sat there over the next minute, people were getting up and leaving, and the only 2 people left in the room was me and our poker player turned political commentator. And he looks at me and says, well, should we go ahead and bet money and break both of our rules today? No, that wasn't a good idea, so we didn't bet real money. But ever since then, I really have been thinking about the chain reaction that happens when politics comes up in a conversation. And at worst, we lose friends, and at best, we just lose our poker club. And so it's kind of stuck with me, this question, is it possible to talk politics and keep friends? This is an especially important question in a democracy, because if we can't talk politics in a democracy, then we're not doing our jobs. We need to talk politics because we need to get things done. We need to talk politics because we need to come up with the best policies, and hopefully we can live in a democracy and still be friends with people. So can we have a chain reaction that isn't the chain reaction that causes enemies in politics? Can we have a chain reaction that instead maybe even makes friendships better? Well, one of the things that we notice is that human life is about conflict. We have conflict all the time. We have conflict with our friends. We have conflict with our partners at home. We have arguments about sports. We have arguments about whether or not we should go out to eat, what restaurant we should go to. We have arguments about whether the pots and pans belong on the top shelf of the dishwasher or the bottom shelf. I think we all know they can be put on either shelf. But what is it about politics that gets people so angry? And part of the answer is that politics are about things that have a large degree of meaning to us. They matter. It matters what we do on immigration. It matters what we do in terms of taxation. And it matters what we do in terms of the government's role in our life. And so people really like sports, but when a sports team wins or loses, it doesn't have a direct impact on our lives the way that politics does. The other reason that people get upset about politics is that politics are about identity. So when we have a position on something in politics, it isn't just that we happen to believe something. It's also that believing that is a key part of what makes us us. So let's take a local political example. Let's say there's a debate about whether or not a pool should be built in a city. Now, this pool is controversial, but if I believe in building a pool, it's not that I just happen to like pools, it's also that I'm the kind of person who believes that we should put in a pool. And if I'm against the pool, it's not that I just happen to be against the pool, but I think it is important that a city spends money on things other than a pool. And so much like sports, when we get into heated arguments, when I'm a Packer fan, I believe that me being a Packer fan is really critical for my understanding of myself. But when you combine high stakes with something that is close to someone's identity, you get controversy. And not only controversy, but a controversy that cuts so deep that it's easy for people to have falling outs with their friends. Now, one of the things that's really important to talk about here is that we are sometimes tempted to think that politics is more negative today than it's ever been. And I think we all know the story of Alexander Hamilton losing the duel to Aaron Burr, and that politics literally resulted in dueling to the death. But my favorite story from early in American history comes from 1798. And Roger Griswold is a representative from Connecticut, And Matthew Lyon is a representative from Vermont. And Lyon is accused of spitting on Griswold. And so at the next assembly of the House of Representatives, this is at the Capitol, Griswold shows up with his cane and starts hitting Lyon over the head with it, 20 times actually, assaults him on the floor of the House of Representatives. Lyon has to fight him off with a fire poker. The whole place is going crazy. And so I wonder, much like our friends playing poker, or our friend here fighting himself off with a fire poker, is it possible to talk politics and keep friends? Well, fortunately, I think there are ways to do that. And in order to talk about that, we need to think about the kinds of things we should do in conversations when we're talking politics. The first of these things is what we refer to as reciprocity. Reciprocity is the idea that I am expecting from you in a conversation exactly what I'm giving to you in the conversation. Now, a lesson on reciprocity was taught to me by my daughter several years ago. It was Valentine's Day. She was 5, and she gets a Valentine. She looks at it and says, "I don't like this Valentine. I wish you wouldn't have given it to me." Throws it on the ground. It's not a very nice thing to do. And so we had to have a long conversation about what we ought to do. And so I took her into her room, and I'm talking to her, and she said, I don't understand what's going on. You told me I'm supposed to be honest, and I didn't like that Valentine. And so it took a while to move past that honesty part, and I finally said, well, if you had made a Valentine for me and I looked at it and threw it on the ground and said I didn't want it, how would you feel? And she said, sad. And I said, so it's probably a good idea to do things that we would want people to do to us. So I thought she might have gotten the lesson. The next morning, we're getting ready for school. And she's tying her shoes, and I'm getting really impatient because I want to leave, and she really likes school. So I said, if you aren't ready in 1 minute, I am leaving without you. And she looks up at me and says, Dad, if you were tying your shoes, wouldn't you want someone to wait for you? She's now 9 years old, by the way, and I still haven't won an argument with her. But this is the point of reciprocity. Are we willing to do for someone else what they are doing for us? And so when it comes to political discussions, reciprocity can take several forms. The first form relates to something that we think is really important in a democracy, and that is freedom of speech. Now, when we think of freedom of speech, we think of the First Amendment and that we all have a right to speak our minds. But when we think about freedom of speech, we usually think about this person, the person talking. The freedom of speech means I have a right to say anything that I want to say and no one can do anything about it. But the problem with freedom of speech, just as freedom of speech, is that it doesn't require anyone to be listening. And so even though freedom of speech we usually think looks like this, most of the time, freedom of speech looks like this. Because if we are going to have a freedom of speech, the rest of us also have to have an obligation to listen. Because if we're all talking all the time, no one's going to hear anyone else, and then we're all speaking, but we're not actually having a conversation. So one important point of reciprocity in our project to talk politics and keep friends is giving an equal amount of time to someone. Are you allowing everyone in the conversation to talk? And we've all been in those conversations where someone's dominating the conversation. In the case of a college professor, we're usually on the wrong end of that. But the question for democracy and the question for keeping friends is, are we being reciprocal in our listening? The other thing that is part of reciprocity is generosity. When we're making political arguments to our friends, we expect our friends to read the best motives possible onto our arguments. So if I'm making an argument against a pool, I'm going to expect that other people in the conversation don't think that I hate children. When someone is making an argument for a pool, we are going to expect that they are not saying that they want to be lazy and send their kids to the pool and not care about them for the rest of the summer, but that, again, that they are the kind of people who believe that a pool is a good idea in a community. And so when we think about the reciprocity of generosity, we're thinking about how it is that we're reading the best possible motives onto the people that we're talking to. Now, in addition to reciprocity, we should talk about mutual respect. Mutual respect is the idea that when we have a political discussion with someone, the very fact that we're having the political discussion already means that we respect the other person enough to have the political discussion. And so when we are talking to someone about politics, mutual respect is the idea that I am going to listen to your arguments, I'm going to pay attention to your arguments, and I'm going to give you the respect that I also expect based on reciprocity. Mutual respect is the idea that in a democracy, we all respect each other enough to know that we're bringing genuinely held beliefs and values to the conversation. And even when we disagree, we have all come to our opinions through a good faith effort to try to figure out what's best for our society. And so, when we're thinking about this, the next time we have political discussions, I have a few takeaways that you can bring into the conversation the next time you have a political debate and want to keep friends. The first of these we've already talked about, and that is listening. The question of listening is not just about sitting there waiting for the other person to be done so that we can talk. It's also not about sitting there thinking of the next thing we're going to say so that we will have something to say. Listening is very important because at the very least it helps us understand where the other person is coming from, and at the most it actually helps us because it may teach us something about what the other person is saying. And that's the other thing that listening helps with, is that having a political debate with someone and wanting to be friends with them at the end means trying to understand why they're making the arguments that they're making. Of course you have the disagreement. You have the disagreement and that's why you're having the argument. But why is it that the person is making that argument? What is it that they're arguing and where is it coming from? That's really a step in the right direction for talking politics and keeping friends. And so, to help us out in political discussion, I have a few things that we can say out loud in political discussions that will help us talk politics and keep friends. These are things like, I understand where you're coming from. You may disagree, but I understand where you're coming from in this argument. I can see why you would believe that. Even though we disagree, I can see, given the things that you're saying, you could conclude the thing that you're arguing. And finally, and this is a really important one, I think we can agree on a basic premise that. Now, in most discussions, you can, if it is a lot of work, you can go all the way to, I think we can agree on a basic premise that we're having a conversation and that we're human. Hopefully you can build from that into something else, some other kind of unifying principle. But if you say this in a conversation, you are more likely to bring that conversation to a point where you can stay friends and still have your disagreement. Now, someone could have listened to all this and might say something like, well, it's always someone else's fault. I'm perfectly nice. Everyone else is mean. And look at society. Society is filled with negativity. Any political debate I get into, my friends, by the way, who are all jerks, they're the ones who are mean to me. So we can practice our phrases. To this person, we might say, I understand where you're coming from. Politics is certainly negative, and it can get us down because there are a lot of people who are negative. I can see why you would believe that because maybe your friends are jerks. Maybe they tend to be jerks in a political conversation. But I think we can agree on the basic premise that politics and political discussions can start with the individual. And just as a chain reaction can develop negatively when someone is a jerk in a conversation and turns the conversation bad, so too could there be a positive chain reaction that when you say these things in a conversation, you actually cultivate friendships. And in the process, you actually cultivate the democracy. And so we might be able to have a poker club that doesn't end up with people storming out of the room. We may be able to have a session of Congress without someone having to defend themselves with a fire poker. And that is why talking politics and keeping friends is key to understanding how we make democracy work. Thank you.